Is that? Are we on? Tell me when you're on live.
That's okay. Look at that. You never look better.
Is everybody ready to go? We want to be live. So let us know when we're live. Anibal? Are we good to go?
Yeah. So what do I do?
It sounds to me like we're good to go. So I'm going to invite, first of all, welcome everybody to Temple Shalom. We'll do formal introductions in a moment. We always like to separate the mundane from the sacred, and we like to do that with a song or a nigun. And I'm going to ask Rabbi Mas at the pulpit and Cantor Leslie at the piano to come up and do Hini Matov.
Hine matov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. 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 Welcome, everyone.
And welcome, Bruchim Abayim, and Chag Sameach. We're into the middle of Shavuot right now. You know, a couple of months ago, Rabbi Anibal Mas from Zedek approached me and said, can we actually do a program together for Tikkun Leil Shavuot? Tikkun Leil Shavuot is actually a night of learning before the first night of Shavuot. And it's brought into place by the rabbis because it is said that the Israelites actually slept in on Shavuot morning at Shavuot, at Sinai. So the idea was that they studied all night so they wouldn't miss it the next time around. Of course, we have a problem this year because Shavuot is right at the end of Shabbat, and we couldn't actually find a way to get together as 4 congregations. So in past years, we've had a community-wide tikkun where all 4 congregations got together, but this year we've actually split it. And last night, Congregation Etz Chaim and Herzliya had their Tikkun Leil Shavuot actually in separate synagogues because of a COVID incident, and we're continuing today. The idea was that we were going to celebrate Tikkun, the idea of learning all the way through the first day of Shavuot. So it's good night has come in today, and we're welcoming you to essentially the second half of Tikkun Leil Shavuot. So we're going to be giving you a topic. The topic's been the same for both events, and it's called Zman Matan Torah, the how and when and why we got the Torah. And each of the congregations have been taking different approaches, and I've been delighted to work with Rabbi Anibal Mas, with Tali Milo, who's a Torah reader and part of the clergy team at Shaarey Zedek, and with Dr. Rina Elbaz, to put this whole thing together, and we're really hoping that you enjoyed the experience as we learn together as congregations and celebrate the beauty of the Shabbat message. So with that, I'm going to invite Leslie to join me, and we're going to do something special. We're going to bring out the Torah. So the two of us are going to do the blessings, and I'm going to ask Tali Milo to take on the honor of bringing the Torah simply right now to the bima beside me. And I'll ask Leslie to come up. So this is on page 494. Please rise, everybody.
Vayehi min Aaron, vayomer Moshe, Kula Adonai, ve'afutzu oivecha, ve'yanusu mesanecha mipanecha, ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, u'devar Adonai mirushalayim, Baruch shenatan Torah, Torah, Baruch shenatan Torah, Torah, le'amo Yisrael, b'kedushato. Beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm just going to say hello to the Torah.
Say hello to the Torah.
Thank you.
So at this point, I'm going to encourage any children who want to join Leslie downstairs for some crafts and other activities. And we will invite you back later on because Cantor Leslie will be singing, we're chanting from the Torah, the Ten Commandments. So you're welcome to come right back down, and we will certainly invite you back later on for the less fun part, okay? So as I mentioned earlier, the topic for today is going to be called Zman Matan Torah, the time of the writing of the Torah. Now, the Bible tells us, the Torah tells us when the Torah is written. Do any of you have any thoughts about what the Torah tells us? Okay. You know, every time we read the Torah and we bring it up into Hagban Glila, we say something. We say, V'zot HaTorah, Asher Sam Moshe, the Israel, Al Pi Adonai B'yad Moshe. Okay? So we say at that time that the Torah was given to us and it was written, Al Pi Adonai. It was coming from the words of God into Moses' hand. So we're told in the Torah, fairly near the end, that the Torah that was written was actually written at Sinai. Okay? And sometimes people say it was completed, of course, after that there's several lines which talk about Moses' passing afterwards. So there's two biblical interpretations. The first is from the Talmud, that Joshua finished the last 8 lines of the Torah, but Rashi writes that Moses wrote about his death with tears. So the general framing of Zman Matan Torah, when the Torah was written, actually comes from the Torah, and it tells us it was written at Sinai. We know enough about Ramses II to place that around 1350 BCE, so we have a sense of the timing at that time. Now, what we're going to do right now is present 2 videos, because both Reform and Conservative Judaism have a slightly different take on when the Torah was written. I'm not going to give you the answers right now. We're going to encourage you to watch the 2 presentations right now. And one of them, I'm going to explain each of them before they come up. The first one is about 10 minutes. The second one is about 5, so I'll ask you to bear with us and have other people present the information rather than us doing so. The first one is called From Let's Talk Religion. It's written by Philip Holm, who's from Sweden, and he's Christian. And he approaches how the Torah was written from an academic perspective. I want to let you know that there's a reason why we're choosing a Christian source first, because it was the Christians in the times of the Enlightenment in Germany that started to take a historical view of their own text and then apply it to the Torah as well. So what Philip Holm is providing actually is about a 200-year understanding of the collected understanding of how the Torah was written from the scientific or academic research that they did. So I'm going to pause right now and we'll turn it over and you will have a chance to watch this particular video.
State administration and cultural development led to a larger production of texts and a scribal elite centered around the temple. Scholars like Matthew Richel and Erhard Bloom have examined this period and argues that we can see a clear break in terms of textual development around the 8th century BCE. It is thus highly likely that the first fragments or parts of the written Hebrew Bible was composed at around this time. Now, at the same time, it should be remembered that just because the stories were written down at this point, that doesn't mean that they didn't exist before. Many of the stories contained in the Torah probably circulated as oral traditions long before they were ever written down. But again, going back to the original question, who wrote it and how did it assume its current form? To answer the first question, we simply don't know. But there are a lot of theories about the chronology of events. A very popular theory in the 20th century, and still today, even if it is contested by some, is something known as the documentary hypothesis that was proposed by a German scholar, Julius Wellhausen. In this theory, it is argued that the Torah was composed by 4 main sources over a period of hundreds of years. The earliest of these is known as the J source, or Yahwist source. The J stands for Yahweh, or the misunderstood pronunciation Jehovah, which was prominent at the time. And this is a personal name for God, Yahweh that is. And the text of the J source is characterized, among other things, by the use of this name for God. The date for this text is uncertain, some placing it during the time of the state of David or his descendants, around the 9th to 8th century BCE. The second is known as the E source, named after another of God's names, Elohim, and is again characterized by a preference for this name for God. This source is likely written after the J source, and the two were later combined, with J serving as the main part of the text. Thirdly, there is the Deuteronomist source, which scholars think is responsible for basically the entire book of Deuteronomy, as well as some of the books outside the Torah, like Samuel and Kings. This source is characterized by things like absolute morality and a lot of laws and things like that. And lastly, there is the P source, or priestly source, written by priests, and this, sort of logically, is characterized by a focus on purity, issues of purity, and rituals, a lot of rituals. As mentioned, the J and E source probably originates in the time of the first temple in Jerusalem, and their contents thus also reflect this environment and this period. Both the D and the P source, however, are much later developments, probably from the time of the exile in Babylon in the 6th and I think 5th centuries, when the people of Israel were forced out of their homeland. The temple, that is the house of God, was destroyed, and in exile they were forced to sort of forge this new identity. And so these two texts also very much reflect that kind of environment, this new kind of thinking. The exile period is incredibly important for the development of Judaism as we know it. It is here that things like personal prayer and many of the rituals that we associate with Judaism comes about, as a result of the drastic change in environment and by living as a minority group. It is likely that important theological changes were made at this time as well. Much archaeological findings show that in the land of Israel and Judah there were many other gods and idols that were worshipped alongside Yahweh. This has led some historians to argue that the Israelite religion pre-exile wasn't monotheistic in the regular sense of the word, but that they practiced monolatry, or a kind of henotheism, that is, the acceptance and belief in many different gods, but worshipping only one, or considering one to be more exalted than the others. It is thus interesting to see how Judaism seems to evolve gradually from a religion much more similar to those of the other empires at the time, that were mostly polytheistic, to eventually become something very different. First through a kind of henotheism, and then during the Babylonian exile especially, there's this shift, it seems at least, to a very much more pure monotheism that would then characterize Judaism going forward. From the time after the Babylonian exile, there is no longer any trace of monotheism in this culture, which seems to imply that something very important happened here. There was a very important shift. Now, the Bible itself states that Judaism was always monotheistic, and that the people over different periods of time sort of turned away from the true religion, and they thus explain it that way. Whether you believe this version of the story or that of historians, they both seem to agree that the move to a more pure monotheism was the result of a very traumatic experience of exile and the destruction of the temple. So the D, and particularly the priestly source, probably stems from this period, when certain theological ideas and developments within the religion had taken place. And this is also, as I said, reflected in the text. It was also probably around this time that the different fragments and sources were gathered together into one text, or a collection of texts, so to speak. Something that is very interesting is that this supposed shift in authors and time periods can sometimes be clearly seen in the text of the Torah itself. One of the best examples, in my opinion, is in the very opening chapters of Genesis, which describes the creation of the world and the story of Adam and Eve. Scholars believe that Genesis 1, that is the first chapter, stems from the priestly source, and thus a later development, and that most of Genesis 2, the second chapter, comes from the J source, which is much earlier. So let's compare them for a second. If you read Genesis 1, it describes how God creates the world in 6 days and then rests on the seventh. It describes how he creates animals and later humans, and it's all very poetic. But then you move on to the second chapter, and the second chapter opens with this. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens. And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. And wait a second. The story seems to start again from the beginning. And the rest of the chapter seems to give a second version of events that sometimes even contradict the first. To begin with, there is a sharp difference between what name is used to refer to God. In the first chapter, God is called exclusively by the name Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God. But suddenly in the second chapter, he is consistently referred to by his other name, Yahweh, or more specifically, their combined name, Yahweh Elohim. According to scholars, this is a clear break between the priestly source and the J source. The nature of God also differs somewhat. In the first chapter, God is very much transcendent, and he creates the world by his word. He also creates the animals, and then he creates man. And as for the genders, it says the following. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. However, in the second chapter, God is a lot more human and described in anthropomorphic ways. For example, he formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. He's also described as walking around in the garden, and when the humans hide, he exclaims, "Where are you?" indicating he's not all-seeing. In this version, also, God creates man first, and then only after he creates the animals. And rather than creating man and female at the same time, Eve is created from the rib of Adam to be of service to him. Clearly then, here we have a very clear indication of the documentary hypothesis at work. It seems clear to scholars that these different aspects of the text were different, or written by different people at different periods, and thus they reflect the different periods in which they were written. The priestly source emphasizes a more transcendent God, something that was more important in later developments, and also describes things like resting on the seventh day, which is likely a reflection of the ritual of the Sabbath that had developed at that time. Things like this can be found all over the Torah, especially the first 4 books, with very clear stylistic language differences, word uses, and even sometimes contradictory versions of the same story. From the 6th century onwards, these texts became more and more viewed as a single whole, and parts outside the Torah itself was added to the canon as well. It should be remembered that the documentary hypothesis is not in any way universally accepted by all scholars of the Hebrew Bible. Many other theories have appeared over the years, especially in the last few decades. But what all of them seem to agree on is the idea that the Hebrew Bible was written, or the Torah I should say, was written by many different hands and over a time period of many centuries, then developing and evolving and changing according to the new kind of ideas and theological developments that were taking place in the Israelite religion. In any case, it was and remains an incredibly interesting and important text, and serves as the basis for some of the largest religions in the world. And whether or not these critical historical theories are true, or whether or not the events recounted in the Bible actually happened or not, is not the important part. Not to scholars of religion, nor to most of the people following these religions either. It's always been about what these stories teach, what emotions they convey, and the symbolic value that they have for the religious identities of billions of people around the world. The historical or non-historical person of Moses is only secondary, really. It is the very story of Moses and the role that he plays in the religious history and the religious mythology that matters most to Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the world, both historically and today. I'll probably leave some links to articles and such things in the description, and feel free to continue this discussion in the comments. I'll see you next time.
So that's the first of the two videos, and that of course expresses the Christian view of these kind of things. We're going to come back later on to discuss the juxtaposition of the two. The second video is short, it's about 5 minutes long, and I want to introduce you to the two people involved, because it's curious to see how Jewish academics have looked at the Christian teachings, which they've been exposed to for the last 200 years as well. So the second video is about 5 minutes. It's part of a much, much longer video. It's available on YouTube. It's about 1 hour and 7 or 1 hour and 10 minutes long. And this is from a group called Digital Hammurabi. It's based out of Johns Hopkins University, and it's about two people who are particularly interested as part of a funded project to talk about the Near East and the Middle East and bring it into modern times along the way. So Dr. Josh Bowen is one of the people who's organizing this thing, and he interviews a Dr. Joel Baden. Okay, so Dr. Joel Baden is Jewish. He is a professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale University. He has a doctorate from Harvard University in 2007, which focuses on the Hebrew Bible. And he has a long, long list of books and publications on this topic. This topic, by the way, is if not Moses, who wrote Torah. So now we're going to kind of move forward and give some new ideas. You've seen some of the ideas here too, but the key along the way is to kind of figure out what do we do with all this other stuff written about us, and what's the general view of modern academics towards this whole topic as well. He was raised Reformed Jewish in Boston, and he talks about the fact, he says, "Your being Jewish remains an important part of my identity, and it probably doesn't hurt that I teach at a Christian divinity school." So nonetheless, he's a very, very renowned scholar on the Hebrew Bible. He is Jewish. I'm just going to give you a sense of what his take right now is of all these ideas.
In spite of the disagreements among scholars, Reinhard Kratz, in a 2016 article, wrote this, quote, "In all of the hypotheses," so for everybody in the audience thinking about the three different hypotheses for how the text goes together, scholars are in agreement that the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, or the Hexateuch, Genesis through Joshua, is composed of at least 3 literary strata: Deuteronomy, priestly writing, which consists of being the holiness code, and the non-priestly texts in Genesis through Numbers. Everything else is up for discussion. So could you elaborate on this statement and focus maybe on what the consensus view among biblical scholars would be concerning this? Like, what is it that you would say everybody's agreeing on, like Genesis 1 and 2 has to be 2 different hands, or things like that, so that in the audience people go, here's where everybody kind of comes away saying, yes, all the scholars' consensus view is that these things are true.
So Kratz is pretty much right. I'll leave Joshua out of it, just because it's a complicated extra thing. But he's right. The priestly stuff, right? And everybody will agree. Genesis 1 is priestly. All of the tabernacle material is priestly. I mean, lots of actually much of what's in the P document is not a problem for people, right? We mostly agree, and have mostly agreed on P, 95% of it for like 100 years. Little bits in the edges here and there. Now, how late P is, how early P is, how the original priestly document and whether there's later priestly stuff. There's all sorts of conversations about that. But the notion of major priestly stratum, right, with all the ritual laws in Leviticus and all the tabernacle stuff in Exodus and most of Numbers, all the legal stuff in Numbers, 100% everybody's on board. The existence of a Deuteronomic source that comprises the majority of the book of Deuteronomy, not all of it, everybody agrees on that too. Again, how old it is, how many layers there are, how is it related to the material in Joshua through Kings, how is it related to the material in Genesis through Numbers. Like, these are all up for debate. But that Deuteronomy, most of it, constitutes a separate literary entity that was not written to be part of or to be next to the priestly material and vice versa. That seems pretty reasonable. When you take those two out, you're left with the non-priestly, non-Deuteronomic material. What I call mostly J and E, but and at that point you're into complete, absolute, like, disaster area in terms of like what people, how people are thinking about this. I think there's basically two sources. Some people think there's 45 different layers, right? Like that's where it is most complicated, admittedly. Most complicated, least clear, and the places where I still have problems sort of separating what's going on are always those places. Right? It's never places where it has to do with P or D. But there are some places where I'm not entirely sure what's happening, and those are all places in the non-priestly. But yes, Genesis 1 is priestly, and Genesis 2 through 4 is not. And Genesis 5 is priestly. And Genesis 6, the first part is not, and then you get the flood story, which is both. And like, everybody will agree on, again, once we all agree on what P is, we mostly do, we're all also going to agree on what not P is. Like, so those big blocks are, now again, are they layers? Are they sources? Were they brought together simultaneously? Were they brought together in a sequence? Or is there some material that precedes the compilation of these texts? Is there some that comes after? Right? There's all sorts of, movable parts. But again, I mean, as you asked in the beginning, right? How consensus is this? That's this process correct, right? This is consensus. There are three major blocks. And I think we would all agree, each one of which has an extensive literary prehistory of how did this thing come to be, and many of which have post-histories, right? Like, once this thing was written, how was it edited? And then we all agree that after the material was all put together into the Pentateuch, roughly as we know it, stuff was added later still. Right? There are parts of the Pentateuch text that we all sort of say, this belongs to none of those three. It's like a later text that's reflective of the some messy situation thereafter. So there's three big blocks, but untold number of hands that have had their way with this. Again, which is not surprising, right? When you think about the transmission, the physical transmission of texts, right? It had to be copied. And scribes had their hand in it. We know from the New Testament, from Mesopotamian literature, right? It's a constant sort of updating and changing of little things here and there. And it's my assumption that stuff has been changed all over the place that we'll never know about because it was changed silently, as it were.
So I grew up Jewish in the North End in an Orthodox synagogue. My education was largely Orthodox, and this stuff would have terrified me as a kid. One of my sisters to this day still can't talk about any of these things. So one of the things that we're going to do right now is come from these teachings, and we're going to discuss how it works in modern times, especially because this issue of who wrote the Torah actually separates all our denominations. And so we thought it would be a really interesting exercise to talk actually about how this thing has evolved over time, how we went from the education piece and into the academic piece, and how it actually works in real life. So the plan right now is that Rabbi Anibal and I are going to participate in each offering you about 10 minutes each on two different things. I'm going to talk about the evolution of the written Torah and how the different denominations look at it. We also know that at Mount Sinai, it is said that we were also given the oral Torah at that time. So my conversation will be on the written Torah, and Rabbi Anibal Mas will talk afterwards about the oral Torah, and afterwards we're going to have a panel discussion where Dr. Elbaz will be asking us some questions to consider back and forth, and we'll also open it up for questions that you might have on this topic as well. So I'm going to start off with a basic question as to who wrote the Torah. The answer is really going to depend on which denomination you choose to follow. Okay, so I'm going to be really clear here that I'm not trying to convince anybody about anything along the way here. Each of us have the beliefs that we have. But I'm just going to give you information about how traditional Judaism, how conservative and how Reform have approached this issue. So you just have a broad understanding, because it very much affects how we kind of live in the moment today in terms of our understanding and our relationship with Torah. So I'm going to start off with traditional Judaism. So we talked already about the idea of the Zod HaTorah that was spoken by God and written for Moses. And this means that this is an exact copy of what Moses wrote down. The oral Torah was also given, and later on its explanations were given in the Talmud. The Torah does not evolve. The key is to apply its precedents from the past into modern times. And these are God's words as originally spoken, and they take precedence over changing human ideas and values. Okay? So the revelation is that the Torah was written at Sinai, and it describes exactly what happened there. This document is placed 1,350 years ago BCE. Any of these other conversations, those videos? No. As a matter of fact, the Orthodox tradition today would actually look at what we're talking about today as not the true path, it's a betrayal of Judaism. Okay? This is just the general framing right now, would be held within the general modern, certainly the ultra-Orthodox movement, and to a large extent by practice in the Orthodox movement as well. This was traditional Judaism. The Orthodox did not exist. This has always been the path of Judaism for about 1,800 years, certainly post Second Temple as well. This was the path. It was written by Moses from God. The Enlightenment hit, and that's where all this Christian teaching came up along the way, because those Christian scholars, in the time of the Enlightenment, they started to look at science and started to apply those techniques to all kinds of texts, starting with theirs and then moving into ours. So they were just simply applying these processes, and that first video in particular kind of talked about the level of detail. There's a lot of other information, word for word, all over the Torah. These are people who are brilliant. They're discussing philosophy, their languages. They knew Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, Greek. Profoundly intellectual people who are just applying a certain kind of science rigor to texts along the way. So Jews weren't doing this research, but they were seeing it, especially in Germany, which was really the source of the Haskalah or the Enlightenment. So here the question becomes: how did the Jewish community respond at that time? So again, it depended on where you lived. In Germany, the Jewish ghettos basically were opened up around 1790. So at that particular time, it was no longer rabbis and cheders and Torah teaching and Talmud teaching, which was dominant. Jews were now allowed to go to Jewish schools, to regular school system. They're allowed into universities. So now we have people in Germany, not unlike in Canada or the United States, that are going and they're getting general education on everything, philosophy to study of language, all the things we talked about beforehand, they were just generally available to them as well. And rabbis and Jews were studying all kinds of subjects that just would not have been available to them in the ghettos or the yeshivas. As well as state law was being developed, where we now had no longer civil law being delegated into the communities to handle, where you saw the rabbinical courts handling everything from contracts to weights and measures and all those other kinds of things. But now we had state laws, which kind of started to diminish the role of rabbinical courts and therefore of rabbis. So all these Jewish people, young, I'll say Jewish men for the most part, were basically going to universities right now. And I'm going to talk about a particular person named Abraham Geiger, okay? So Abraham Geiger is an interesting guy. I've got some biographical information about him. He was born in 1810, so it was about 20 years after everything was opened up already. And his friends got him money to go to the University of Heidelberg. He wasn't a rabbi. He was just a Jewish man who basically goes to the University of Heidelberg. He focuses on philology, which is the study of languages, Syriac, Hebrew, the classics. And then he also attends lectures in philosophy and archaeology. And after a semester, he goes to the University of Bonn. So he's basically in the general mainstream and being exposed to all of this literature. He loves his Judaism. He's got incredible counterparts, Samuel Holdheim. Later on, we'll talk about Zechariah Frankel and Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. These are all his contemporaries at this time. And he studies the Arabic. He studies the Quran. He wins a prize for his essays. What did Muhammad take from Judaism? This is a very, very well-emancipated man. And what he winds up doing is basically becoming what is essentially the founder of Reformed Judaism. He's looking at the differences. He's got all this information regarding the Torah. And he was a part of a large group, but he's the person who kind of came up to the front more than anything else. What's happening here generally is the German rabbis are accepting scientific evidence as having a role in shaping Judaism. So and all these conversations we talked about beforehand about multiple writers are hugely important. Also, what's happening at the same time, the videos didn't get into, is the role of archaeology. The Middle East is the most dug up area in the world because there's three major religions trying to find their sources along the way. And what's happening along the way, I'm going to show you one book that was written quite recently by two Jewish, well-known archaeologists. It's called the Bible Unearthed. Okay? Okay, want to kill the video? There's something going on in the background. So the authors are Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, just in case you're wondering whether they're Jewish or not. Okay? And it's a huge, very, very careful detailed analysis of the Torah, of the stories of the Torah against the biblical evidence. And time again and again and again, they say the stories of the Torah are simply written at the wrong time for them to be written around the time of Moses. That's kind of the short answer along the way. The Amalek, the stories in the Bible, actually were 700 years later. And there's many, many instances in this book, amongst many others, which represents a certain kind of consistency between, I'm sorry, Judith, can you mute whatever's there? Okay. Okay, thank you. Just move to the next slide. You're well off in your slides anyway. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to just continue on right now. So basically, these Orthodox trained rabbis are being exposed to all of this in Germany. Abraham Geiger could not become a university professor. He wanted becoming a rabbi, but he winds up leading this whole movement along the way in Germany that's starting to look in a different way at this whole thing. What he comes up with is basically several themes which actually wind up populating Reformed Judaism. He says the Torah was written by multiple authors and is redacted. It's divinely inspired, but not divinely spoken by God. Okay, so the idea of divine inspiration is there along the way. So we're therefore freed from literal interpretation and application of the Torah. He said the Torah reflects the author's understanding. We talked about many authors here, going back to the 6th or 7th or 9th century BCE. The Reform view was that the Torah reflects those authors' understandings of Sinai at their time that it was written, as transmitted generationally. So Jews have individual autonomy in determining the context of that revelation. Judaism is an evolving process of belief, not a fixed set of historically mandated rules and regulations. Later on, they talk about the Talmud, and they say that the rabbis will interpret the Torah as required. I will mention that in 1897, the Reform movement said we're not formally bound to the rules of the Talmud, because the rabbis then, too, were also interpreting Torah as they understood it in its day as well. We look at it as a source, but don't have the sense of connectedness that is actually part of the conservative movement. So we actually say that we write Torah in every generation. They wrote it in the 9th century, they wrote it in the 7th century, and theoretically, as we experience Sinai right now, we write it and modernize it, not in terms of changing the text, but changing our understanding and application of how it might work in our lives. We say we honor tradition, but we embrace modernity. And by the way, Reform has no problems with the positions taken by we believe in Jewish pluralism. It's not an issue along the way. So the reason I'm bringing these things up is because this was the first reaction. So now we see this happening in Western Europe, and I said beforehand, everybody has... Actually, why don't we just shut those off, okay? Yeah, my problem is I got a voice talking into my ear, and it's not doing me particularly well. Okay, just kill the PowerPoint. Thank you. Can you just shut off the PowerPoint?
He's an interference. It's coming through the wireless.
Okay, it doesn't matter. I'm happy to not have it on. So now we have how does the rest of the world react? I told you that the Enlightenment took place in Western Europe. It did not take place in Eastern Europe. So everybody's living in ghettos. They're not exposed to university educations. None of this research taking place in Germany is available anywhere else. So I'm going to talk about the Rev. Moses Schreiber, who's one of the truly, truly great traditional scholars. He's basically a Hungarian rabbi and one of the most prominent yeshivas. And he's also known as the Khatam Sofer. And this is what he writes because of what's happening in Germany. Okay, so we're starting to see the beginning of a schism here and how Judaism is evolving. He writes, "May your mind not turn to evil and never engage in corruptible partnership with those fond of innovation who have strayed from the Almighty and His law. Do not touch the books of Rabbi Moses Mendelssohn from Dessau, and your foot will never slip. The daughters may read German books, but only those which have been written in our own way, according to the interpretations of our teachers. Be warned not to change your Jewish names, speech, and clothing, God forbid. Never say, times have changed. We have an old father who has never changed and never will change. The order of prayer and synagogue shall remain forever as it has been up to now, and no one may presume to change anything of its structure." So these are very, very heavy concepts. We're going to start to see right now basically a huge schism within Judaism. It's largely based on where one lived along the way. So, as one might guess, this was the beginning of the end in terms of any kind of harmony within the Jewish structures right now. If you want to think of a mechitza, one side the Torah was divinely written, the other side it was Torah divinely inspired, and the path started to vary at that particular point. Reform Judaism really started to pick up volume when it came to the United States, because there were no Russian Jews there at the time. It was largely people coming from Western Europe, and that's where it really got a lot of traction. And while I don't want to talk about the movement, I'm going to talk about Reform's view of Torah, and following that I'm going to talk about the conservative view of Torah as well. In 1999, this Pittsburgh Principles talked about the fact that we're invited to have a dialogue with the sources of our tradition. When it comes to Torah, we say we affirm that the Torah is the foundation of Jewish life. We cherish the truths revealed in Torah, God's ongoing revelation to our people. Torah is a manifestation of Ahavat Olam, God's eternal love for the Jewish people and for all humanity. We affirm the importance of studying Hebrew. We're called by Torah to lifelong study of Torah and the whole array of mitzvot, and to the fulfillment of those that address us individually and as a community. So this is where things are sitting on the Reform side. While many people believe that conservative Judaism came from Orthodoxy, it actually comes from Reform. Reform started to get to some pretty interesting and edgy places in the end of the 1800s. The Treifa the Treifa Seder is quite well known. It doesn't matter what it is, but it really started to get edges. It was starting to reject the ideas of Israel, and even questioning whether they needed to believe in God because God was superstitious. It started to move quite far. It's moved well back since then, but it really kind of moved to some very interesting places. And a lot of Reform rabbis got quite upset about this thing, and they broke away. Meanwhile, a lot of Russian Jews were coming into the United States at that time. They did not want their past, but they found Reform to be way too far where they can go. And it really led to a breakaway group trying to decide how do we form a different kind of understanding of Judaism. And this is all in North America at that particular time. And what they did is they went to a fellow named Zachariah Frankel. They went back to Germany to find the philosophical sources for how they could frame Judaism not in the traditional way. By the way, the word Orthodox, I have to tell you, was actually a response by the Reform movement to Khatam Sofer. They said, "You're so Orthodox," and it became a term of stillness and of steadiness and of backwardness. And Orthodox traditional Judaism adopted that particular word. As you can tell from Khatam Sofer's language, it actually froze Judaism. Traditional Judaism had always evolved, but because they couldn't look forward, there was a sense of stuckedness at that particular time, and you'll see a lot of the origins of ultra-Orthodoxy kind of stemming from what the Khatam Sofer at that particular time. So conservative Judaism, they went back, as I said, to Germany, and they went to Zacharias Frankel, who I mentioned was a counterpart of so many of these other people. He too was trained into this whole notion along the way. He was unhappy with the Orthodox rejection of scientific study. He was also unhappy with the budding Reform movement's rejection of Jewish nationalism and how quickly it was going to discard mitzvot. So he found a third way. It was something that didn't reject halakha, but it wasn't going to be a slave to it. And that was the interesting point in the middle along the way. And he called it positive historical Judaism. Later on in the United States, Solomon Schechter, by the way, he had his own seminary in Germany, and it was called the Jewish Theological Seminary. And so that's the name that they wound up picking up later on in North America as well. That's the name. The JTS is the college for conservative rabbis here too. Solomon Schechter described it in 1902 as historical Judaism. And conservative Judaism isn't actually conservative. It means a way to conserve Judaism. So it's not conservative as compared to liberal. It's actually a process of how do we conserve Judaism and what it means. And it became very popular very quickly because it captured the interest of Eastern European Jews as well as those who were disaffected by Reform. I'm going to leave some of those other conversations. So basically, these are some of the things that the conservative movement would say about Torah, okay? We combine a positive attitude towards modern culture, acceptance of critical secular scholarship regarding Judaism's sacred texts, and a commitment to Jewish observance. They believe that scholarly study of Jewish texts indicates that Judaism has been constantly evolving to meet the needs of the Jewish people in varying circumstances. And here's the three basic conservative tenets. The conservative movement accepts multiple authorship and the later writing and dating of the Torah, but continues to affirm the legally binding character of Jewish law, Torah, Talmud, and Halakha. The idea of revelation, the revelation of the Torah at Sinai was divine. Judaism would accept that here as well, Reform would as well, as it was to its interpreters, the Talmud and later. But not just at Sinai, they say that it has evolved over time, yet its traditions are worthy of preservation. And as far as the Talmud goes, unlike Reform said, we severed our formal connection to the Talmud in 1897, the general framing of the conservative movement is that God breathed into those writers the divine spirit, but it was human beings who wrote down what they understood God meant and want. So there's actually a strong pushback along the way there. So that's kind of where I'm at. I just want to leave with one final image then. It's not on the screen anymore. I talked about the chitzah between Orthodox Judaism and Reform, divinely written by Orthodox Judaism. Reform and conservative Judaism both fall into the place of talking about divine inspiration. So it allows us a little more or a lot more flexibility in how we look at the Torah to this day. So just giving you a sense right now, general framing about how the written Torahs move forward. When we talk about when, there are different whens. You can choose what you need. Thank you. Anibal? I'm going to invite Anibal Mas to come up and talk about the oral Torah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Kinko.
Okay. I love the differences between different movements in Judaism. It's fascinating. Somebody asked me how many Orthodox rabbis do you need to change a light bulb? I said, none. They don't believe in change. How many Reform rabbis do you need to change a light bulb? None. Everybody changes things whatever they want. But then they said, how many conservative rabbis do you need to change a light bulb? So we have no clue. They are still talking in New York. So the thing is, I don't believe that the difference between the conservative and Reform is so much about the written law, but about what the oral law means to us and how it shapes Judaism. Let me explain what I'm saying with that. And I will say that even in Orthodoxy, the written law or the written Torah is not a big deal. He goes, what did Rabbi Mike say? What do you mean the written Torah is not a big deal? Well, have you ever been to a yeshiva? What do they study at the yeshiva? The Talmud. They barely touch the Torah. Of course, we read the Torah every Shabbat, Monday, Thursday, Saturday afternoon, but the deep study of the Torah is not nearly as much as the study of the Talmud, to the point that you will find lots of scholars in Talmudic law, that they have big gaps in the Torah studies. Why? Because the written Torah, yes, we have it in the Ark, it's a holy object, but it does not tell us how to live a Jewish life. If you try to understand how to become a Jew, or how to live a Jewish life from the written Torah, you're going to fail miserably, because it does not have enough information to let us know what to do. So that's why we put so much emphasis on the oral law, because it's the body of law that came to fill up the gaps, and it will give practical information on how to live a Jewish life. Now the thing is, what is the oral law? And we say, well, usually the most common answer is the oral law is the Talmud. God gave the Torah to Moses. God explained to Moses everything Moses needed to know about the Torah and how to apply Torah. And then Moses kept that information orally. And then Moses taught that to Joshua. Joshua taught that to the elders. The elders taught it to the prophets, and so forth. That is, for example, the beginning of Pirkei Avot. If you read Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah number 1, that's what it says. Moshe kivel Torah miSinai umsara Yeshua, Yeshua lezkenim, and so forth. You have that chain of tradition, how Moses received this oral law, and it was passing from generation to generation. That is the standard answer. Now, I don't really believe that. I don't know if that makes me conservative, reform, or what. But I don't really believe that what the Talmud contains is actually the oral law that it was communicated to Moses. I do believe personally that there is such thing as oral law. I think that the real oral law is very small. What I'm talking about is filling up the gaps of what we cannot understand from the Torah. Everything else that came after were none other than the rulings of the Sanhedrin. So basically the Sanhedrin was like a court of law that it would determine what to do. And the Torah says, so if you have a question, go to the judges of your generation. They will tell you what to do. So basically the Torah is creating this body of law. So, and you will see that it happens in every country, that sometimes different generations' courts of law will overrule previous generations' courts of law or legislations. That's why we have new rulings every time. If you read the newspaper, you will see all that. And I don't think back then, 2,000 years ago, was any difference. Now, the thing is, all those rulings was what I believe created the foundation of the Talmud. So what happened is, eventually, that unified view of the law, because of the Babylonians, the Romans, disappeared. So there was no unified body of law anymore. So what I believe what happened is Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, the one who wrote the Mishnah, put together the rulings from the Sanhedrin that they were available to him, and he wrote it down. And that's what became the Mishnah. And then the discussions about those laws becomes the Gemara, and the two together became the Talmud. Now the problem is when, and I don't know when that happened, when rabbis decided that all that information was not something that it was created by the Sanhedrin, but it was something that it was divinely revealed to Moses. And again, I don't know when that happened, but it was a decision of the rabbis. If you go to the Talmud, you will never be a straight connection to Sinai. You will say, said Rabbi so-and-so in the name of Rabbi so-and-so, period. Sometimes you have three levels. Say Rabbi so-and-so in the name of Rabbi so-and-so in the name of Rabbi so-and-so. But that's it. That it doesn't go any further. To me, that's another proof that there is not clear link with the revelation on Sinai. I believe that the oral law was the creation and the evolution of the decisions of the Sanhedrin. So, unfortunately, with the laws of our homeland and the fact that Jews moved all over the world, that idea of unified law got lost. But from there to say that every word of the Talmud was revealed to Moses and Sinai, think you will need to take a huge leap of faith to understand that. So coming back to the difference between movement, I believe that the main issue here is to basically decide how binding all that law contained in the Talmud is. I believe that it should keep evolving because the law contained there were resolutions that they were given to bring solutions and meaning to specific generations. And that's why that should have never stopped. And the fact that there were a group of people who decided to, what's the word, divinify? Is such a word, divinify? Is it in your dictionary?
Sure.
You know what I mean. They tried to make it divine, make it a huge problem. Make it a huge problem for an ever-evolving Judaism. I believe that many of the practices that we have are also practices that they came from the northern kingdom. I don't know if you remember, after King Solomon, there was a division between northern kingdom and southern kingdom. Southern kingdom was the one with the temple. Jerusalem was in the south. King Jeroboam was in the north, and he was jealous of Jerusalem because everybody was making these pilgrimages to the south. So he wanted to create a temple in the north. So he created a religion based on Judaism to have a temple there and to compete with Jerusalem. Eventually, the northern kingdom disappeared. But what happened? What happened with all the practices developed in the northern kingdom? I believe that they were slowly permeating the south as well because people were going back and forth. And that also became Jewish practice. And at one point, people said, hey, why do we do this? Oral law. It's not in the Torah, but we do it. It must be oral law. That's other reason of why we have things that eventually it was decided that it was oral law. So this is very interesting. That's my belief that what the oral law is. It's a combination of the ruling of the Sanhedrin plus all these practices from the north that eventually became practices of the south and nobody knew why they were doing it, plus all the other discussions that came at the time of the Gemara. And that is basically what we call Judaism in these days. That's why I believe it is okay to question how binding that it is and to find ways to keep that body of law evolving. And I think I will leave it there for now, and then we'll continue later with the questions.
So what I'd like to do right now is invite up Dr. Rina Elbaz, who's going to act as our moderator. She's the Director of Education at Shaarey Zedek, and she's taken on the role of stepping forward. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking time in your Sunday, and Chag Sameach to everybody. And to rabbis, that was brilliant. And it raised a question where I feel that it's really not a question of who wrote the Torah, because we all have the same Torah in our ark. If you go to France, where I lived for 20 years, or you go to Israel, you go to South Africa, the Torah itself is the same. It seems to be how we interpret it that would be different. And I was thinking about the difference between Reform and Conservative because it's true what you were saying. The general public doesn't really know what are the differences between these two movements. The belief in kashrut, descent, is it matrilineal, patrilineal? Who is a Jew? These are existential questions. The use of Hebrew language. Are we a nation or are we just a religion? And these are questions that make a great difference in how we view these two movements. So one of the things that I would like you to comment on is, how is it that the Torah itself hasn't changed? Those scrolls are the same anywhere you go in the world, down to the very last letter. How can we explain that?
Well, that is more about the written Torah. It's interesting. When was the time that...
Is your mic on?
Sorry?
Is your mic on?
I don't know.
I think so.
Can you hear me back?
We hear you too with
Okay.
Prophet Moses.
Oh, well.
I hope you heard everything. Hello.
Oh, that's much better, yes.
It basically, I can't remember what time in history it was that it was decided, the final text of the Torah. And then there was a master copy created, and everybody was copying it from the same place. So it's very difficult to try to guess what it was before that, but because it was a consensual decision. This is going to be the master copy, and then that's why you have Sephardi, Ashkenazi, because that happened before that evolution. And that's why we can say that we all have the same Torah. We are talking about all this conversation comes from way before that, before
That's right.
the rabbis made a decision. This is the master copy.
And that's the one thing that doesn't change, despite all of the different denominations.
I think there's actually 3 codexes that they work with. And there are differences.
Codex, that's
yeah,
like
there are 3 different codexes that they work with, 3 different master copies. And if there's differences between the 3, 2 out of the 3 qualify. So it's actually it's not perfect, because anytime you go for 2 out of 3, it could be that the third one is correct. So even then I find it fascinating because the whole world, for example, gematria, comes from the notion of the idea of a perfect text. And it might not be. And it's just kind of fascinating to kind of approach how it goes. But to me, it almost doesn't matter, because we still find I think every branch of Judaism finds that it's a sacred text. We are all people of the book. And we get inspired by the stories, if not the particular words. So I don't find myself, I find it lovely that these texts come back, and I know that the Dead Sea Scrolls were very important because they confirmed many of the texts that were already in place. I think the original codexes right now probably go back to, I'm not sure if the earliest is 1005, so it only goes back a little over 1,000 years. So, but the Dead Sea Scrolls actually confirm many of the texts that they are generally in play as they were then.
Thank you. This will lead me to the next question. So we speak about Torah Emet, a Torah of truth. In that case, what truth does the Torah actually communicate to us as a people? Is it a verifiable historical truth, or is it something else? So senior lecturer at Pardes Institute in Jerusalem, Judy Klitzer, suggests that the Bible's truth are religious and moral in profound ways. The Bible's truth addresses the complexity of human relationships, the human condition. And however, modern archaeological discoveries aside, how do both of these movements view the concept of Torah Emet?
I believe that the Torah is truth, not necessarily factual. I'm sorry, I sound too philosophical.
But maybe that's what it is.
I believe it's the truth, but not necessarily factual. It represents a set of principles. They are true. And I believe that that's when we say that the Torah is divinely inspired, is because the principle it represents, which are absolutely truth, and I believe in that. And again, probably to say that, I need to take a leap of faith, right? But I believe that the principle presented by the Torah is truth, even though the Torah itself, the stories presented in the Torah may not be factual. It's impossible to prove it. But does not mean that the Torah is not presenting a universal truth.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I'm going to build on that. Can I just start? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Turn it off, turn it back on. It's amazing how technology works. I like the idea of universal truth. You know, one of the things that I appreciate in the Torah is every person in the Torah is hugely dysfunctional. You know, and there's so much
They're
to be...
human.
They're human. That's right. So we're not talking about concepts like saintliness and those other kind of things. There's so much to learn from the experience of the way the rabbis wrote. Rabbis? Authors? I'll use the word authors. I'm comfortable doing that personally. The authors wrote the Torahs. They had stories to tell and reasons to tell them. Because there was teachings to learn from every one of their lives along the way, how people could... I'd look at somebody like Jacob, and he was a real jerk when he was a kid. And how he became actually the Bet Yaakov afterwards. He was the one who formed the 12 tribes afterwards. And I think those where the universal truths come is the human experience. There's stories in there that it's hard to establish truth because they're in the myth phase. Stories of Adam and Eve, and Noah and the ark and his drunkenness. There's an amount of detail there, so many centuries and millennia before things were being written, that they had to be part of an oral history that were passed down. No different than we would devalidate the stories of indigenous communities here talking about Turtle Island as an experience of North America. I think that these just are our stories, and they are our truths, and it's from which we gain all of our ways of living. There's a Jewish way of life that's expressed in those stories. Options given to us in how we're similar from our neighbors and how we're different from them. Ma tavu ohalecha Yaakov. You know, that we were clearly separated along the way and seen as something very, very special. So to me, I look at those as truths that we can grow back. We can find an empowered Judaism today from those stories.
Thank you, Rabbi. Dr. Rabbi Mark Angel, he addresses the topic of reconciling Torah and scientific truth, and he explains that the Rambam made clear throughout the Guide to the Perplexed that the Torah and science, reason, philosophy cannot be in conflict because God is the author of both science and the Torah. So there must be one truth underlying both. How do the Reform and Conservative philosophies view the relationship between Torah and scientific fact?
So you're reminding me of a story that when I was in grade 8 or grade 9 at Joseph Linsky Collegiate, and we were all little, you know, we had Orthodox rabbis teaching us all the time. And I remember a particular time when, you know, we were told right now we're in year 5,782, and that means the world is 5,782 years old, the world was created in 6 days, and there was a day of rest, right? And of course, we know that many fundamentalist Christian faiths kind of believe in a world of 6,000 years, and they believe in new earth things where somehow people could walk with the dinosaurs. So we approached the two rabbis, I remember, in 2 consecutive classes. We thought we were being really smart. Okay, we said, so how can you justify science and the Torah? You know, which talk about, you know, how can you have, fossils which are millions of years old? And the rabbis both looked at us, 2 Orthodox rabbis, and said, oh, come on, these are metaphors. A day can easily be an eon or an epoch or a billion years. These stories are symbols, they're metaphors, don't take them seriously along the way. And what struck me at that time is that Judaism has never generally had a problem generally, there are exceptions in Israel, generally had a problem in reconciling science. It's all the reasons you talked about. If God created the earth, God created all the rules of the universe at the same time. So there's just no real issue in my view. And I was actually taught that by Orthodox rabbis. We've never put Galileo to the test. It's not part of our history to do that. So it's just never been an issue.
And also you have to distinguish between what the rabbis call Haggadah and Halacha, right? We have to understand that all these discussions that we are talking about here is Haggadah. Because at the end of the day, all this, who wrote the Torah and science, has very little to do with Jewish practice. Realize that we are talking about 2 different things here. That the Jewish practice is independent from who wrote the Torah and how the Torah was written and what the Torah had to say about science. 2 different things. It's that's the thing you have to have into consideration. But I also believe that there is no contradiction between Torah and science. Even Maimonides in the 1100s, he says something very interesting. I don't know if I'm going to say it anyway. He said, people who believe that there is a contradiction between Torah and science is because they don't know enough Torah or they don't know enough science.
And it's Albert Einstein said the same thing. How could this whole thing be created without a God behind it?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It reminds me of the story of this little girl who asked her mother, Mom, how can we have human in the planet? And Mom said, well, God created Adam and Eve, and then they have children, and the children had children, and then many, many generations. Here we are. The girl was not happy with the answer. So she goes and asks her dad. She said, Dad, how come we have humans? And then the dad started to talk about, first were the monkeys, and they started to evolve, and little by little they became people, and here we are. Then the girl she was confused now. She goes back to the mother and said, what's going on here? You told me about Adam and Eve, and Dad is talking to me about the monkeys. So That's very easy to explain. I'm talking about my side of the family. He's talking about his side of the family.
Good one, Rabbi. That actually leads me to my next question.
Which side of the family are you on?
So, talking about creation and creation of Adam Harishon, which actually in the Torah is translated in the Hebrew, the first human. So in the trigger video that we watched, Let's Talk Religion, the speaker, Philip Holm, interprets the Hebrew text of God's creation of the woman from man's rib, describing the purpose as to serve man. But the traditional Hebrew actually translates her purpose to be a helpmate. It says that he took a piece of the rib so that she would not be above him or below him, she would be beside him. So can there be, the words are the same, but the way we translate it and interpret it can be very different. So how do both of these movements interpret the creation story, and how, I mean, we talked about the actual Bereshit that has two creation stories. So how do we reconcile these?
I'll start with this one. I found that the question actually has another level behind it. It's just how do we interpret generally? And one of my favorite books is actually it's written by Lawrence Kushner. God was here and I did not know it. And it's all about one line of Torah, and he pulls it apart like remember that string cheese the kids have? And he creates about 1,000. It's like I described it. He describes it almost as the one line which launched 1,000 devars. So I think the Devar Torah, which is actually a commentary on the Torah, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about how we interpret, is that every time we step into the Torah, certainly as rabbis, we're finding new meaning all the time. So yours was one story, and that's another story, and I think there's many other stories. When I look at that line, for example, that you talked about pulling from the rib and being a helpmate, I was thinking, if I was going to write about that today, we're in Pride Month right now, okay? I'd be joking, for example, about the fact that the science would tell us that Lucy was the first human being, not a man. So there's interesting things, but also the idea, for example, if I was going to write about it today, I would say, it's interesting that they took a rib from one person, which means there's a perfect DNA copy along the way, and somehow this became just evolved into a woman, but it could evolve into anything. And I think there's an interesting conversation about the fact that, about gender fluidity, which can flow out of that concept, which has nothing to do with helping. It just got to do with the story itself can pull off all these beautiful modern images which help us today about understanding why are we making all these crazy differences of heterosexuality and denying and making everything binary and heterocentral rather than finding concepts which are broadly inclusive. So I would look at that second story about the rib as actually talking about the huge commonality of that experience of sexuality, rather than the randomness of man being created and then a woman created, which actually creates a separateness between the two. So I think the question is interesting, but I think the answer is yes to your interpretation, yes to another interpretation, and yes to millions of others, because that's what we do. We get to go to the Torah and pull out modern meaning from them.
Thank you. Rabbi, would you like to add to that?
No, I was just going back to the phrase that first, nowhere it says that it was a rib. Right?
See, even there.
Nowhere.
Yeah.
And then basically, the description that I see in the Torah, it says that the first human was both male and female. And it was like cut in half. Right? And then you have two halves that eventually they look for each other. Right? And they want to be one again. So, but I believe again, that even it says there, Ezer kenegdo. That's the word is used in Hebrew. Ezer kenegdo. I don't know if you realize that there is what is the word? Oxymoron.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Ezer means helper. Negdo means against. So how can you be a helper and against? And it basically, you have a beautiful teaching. Depends on the kind of relationship you have. Right? If you have a loving relationship, the two help each other. Otherwise, they are against each other all the time. Right? Ezer kenegdo, it's up to you to be an ezer or to be against. So,
or maybe to provide constructive criticism, and only somebody who's very close to you can do that.
yeah, but again, you see how we are here talking a lot about all these kind of ethical comments, but I would like to talk a little bit about the law. how can we do what we do if we have all these challenges to the validity of either the written law or the oral law?
So here's a thought, an analogy perhaps. How many of you here have eaten a fortune cookie? You crack it open, right? You pull out the paper. Today you will meet a tall stranger. So when somebody comes along and fits the description, you interpret that little piece of paper. That could be anything, right? And so I think it's the same. And depending on our sensibilities and our way of looking at the world, or as individuals and as different movements, we're going to take that comment, that very simple comment, and we're going to make it our own truth.
Yeah, I think it's clear that the written law, the written Torah, does not have enough information. We need someone to give us an interpretation to fill up the gaps. And I believe that in this generation, regardless of who wrote the oral law, there are at least two different answers to that. One is you relied on the rabbis to fill up the gaps for you, or you do it yourself, which is more aligned with the Reform movement.
Yeah, just going to clarify. I think in the conservative movement, Rabbi Anibal joked about the 25 rabbis in the CJLS that are hanging around in New York making decisions. In the Reform movement, rabbis are not considered to be judges; they're considered to be teachers. So we encourage people to have lifelong study, and we will engage them and help them in any way they can to find their path. So, but again, it's the commitment. I think the common thing is the commitment to lifelong learning of the Torah, because it is an incredible source for how to live one's life.
It is. For every generation. And this is when we are going to open the floor to you, the congregation. If you have any questions, there's a lot of information. It's a lot of food for thought today. We do have some actual food in a few minutes, so don't worry. Can't have a Jewish celebration without it. But would you like to ask some questions? And every question is a good question. Phil.
What about Lilith?
So Phil asks about Lilith. So Lilith was supposed to be the first feminine creation?
Thank you. That's a midrash. That's a midrash. And I believe, thank you for the question, because I believe that our relationship with midrashim is what created so much dissension inside Judaism. The fact that we have many rabbinic creations that were probably made to accompany a teaching, sometimes a moral teaching, ethical teaching, and all of a sudden the midrash became divine. It was something given by God, and I believe that Lilith is a story that talking that it was a creation before the creation, that it was destroyed. Why? Because of Lilith. Lilith was the woman who didn't want to obey her husband, right? And then that's why that creation was destroyed, and then eventually was the second creation, that the one we know.
Maybe it was because the husband needed fixing.
But the thing is, the way I take it is we have to be very careful, because then what happened is there was a rabbi who decided that was divinely given, and then you have generations after that of people who actually stopped believing in the oral law and started believing in Rabbi so-and-so, which is not the same. I do believe in the oral law, but I don't believe in Rabbi so-and-so. That's the difference. So we have to be very careful with the midrashim, that one thing is to try to teach point, and the other thing is to believe that it was divinely given or revealed to us. And we have to accept actually that the development of of Kabbalah and mystical Judaism also had a huge impact in the way Jewish law evolved. So that's another. We haven't even talked about that.
That's going to be the next time we get together. Are there other questions? Yes.
This isn't specifically to what you're talking about. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
But I wonder, within the conservative movement, if there's ever been a discussion to change the name conservative, because as you've explained, it's to conserve, it doesn't mean conservative as opposed to liberal, but I bet even a lot of Jews don't realize that.
Well, it's interesting.
And when you hear the word conservative,
I'm just going to repeat it
doesn't
so
speak
they
to
can repeat the
conservative,
question.
And it causes a lot of maybe wrong ideas about what the conservative movement means.
I'm just going to repeat the question because I want to make sure that our online audience can hear it. So it's a question about the name of the conservative movement. Does it really do justice to what the movement represents? And I would also add perhaps here that in Israel it isn't called conservative, it's called Masorati, which means tradition. So that might also,
Traditional Judaism. Yeah.
it might be part of the response.
I found it interesting. Solomon Schechter called it positive historical Judaism. I haven't heard of any
That's good.
inclination towards change. Have you?
No, I don't like the name either, so I'm with you.
Yeah.
It's reactionary
Yeah.
instead of,
I don't like
you
the
know,
name either.
it's all like offensive, no,
It's,
defensive.
but even within, I believe, and I will leave it there because otherwise we could talk all day about that. I believe that the conservative Judaism, the way it was created, doesn't exist anymore. Stopped existing long ago. And what we have now is, and I think we are moving towards that, I mean, to solidify that idea of two main groups. One is Orthodox, and the other one is liberal. That without labels. Orthodox and liberal. Because you will have, and in fact, you can have conservative synagogues with Reform rabbis, Reform synagogues with conservative rabbis, Reconstructionist synagogues with non-denominational rabbis, and so forth. We have so many. So what is conservative? I think the conservative as a movement, and with the name conservative, made a lot of sense when it was created. Doesn't make any sense anymore, but I would say, who cares? Doesn't exist anymore the way it was created anyway. So that's my take.
Rabbi Anibal is almost quoting exactly what's showing up in the Pew studies in the United States, where there's actually it's a fairly broad spectrum, and conservative movement, just like the Reform movement, is actually quite broad. There's some I know synagogues in the States which are probably temples in the States which are probably more to the so-called right of the Shaarey Zedek thing, but in the conservative movement, we grew up with conservative synagogues that had mechitzot. Mechitzas, now we have conservative egalitarian, and more recently there's a group on the conservative side, the conservadox side, that are broken out of the conservative movement because they consider conservative Judaism to be moving far away. And I think that largely we're capturing into that sense of how much do we hew to tradition, how many of our kids know Hebrew, is the Torah cycle appropriate, what do we do with intermarriages? 72% of all Jews intermarrying right now. Where do our congregations go? And that'll largely determine the shape of the future. So I really appreciated Anibal's comments, Rabbi Anibal's comments about where we were 100 years ago is probably not where we are right now. And we're trying to figure out along this continuum, it's a continuum without clear breaks along the way. And we'll form and reform as Jews. Traditional Judaism always changed over time. One incident broke it because of the view of Torah, but it's continuing to evolve whether the rabbis want it or not. It's because it's ultimately Judaism goes to where we need it to be on an individual basis.
Rabbi Finkel, what you're saying about the continuum, God's name itself is the continuum. Mm-hmm. As they called it Yahweh. Don't want to pronounce the name, but it contains the past, the present, and the future. I just, the fact that you're all here today gives me great hope that this continuum will continue and will allow us to go from strength to strength. And I want to thank you very much for participating in this panel. And we're now going to move on to the next part of our program, which is reading the 10 Commandments.
10 suggestions.
Actually, it's dibrot, right? Which are statements.
Statements, that's right.
It's a statement, and sometimes the translation just doesn't do it justice.
So I'm pleased to invite up Tali Mila, who will act as our Gabbai, and Cantor Leslie Emery, who will be reading the Torah.
Here's your pen. Thank you, that was great.
Yeah, since I do have something. Yeah, give me a second.
I noticed there was a kid hand up. Did you have a question over there? You're allowed to ask questions too. In fact, you're the most important person in the room to have a question answered. What's your question, Kaya? Why is Mount Sinai not the biggest mountain? Rabbi Anibal.
What was the question?
Well, that is exactly the point.
Why is Mount Sinai not the biggest
It's
mountain?
exactly the point. Is to show us that you don't have to be the tallest, the strongest, or the smartest to receive the Torah and to practice Torah. That means that everybody can practice Torah. So that was the point, that purposely God chose not the biggest, not the tallest, so we can learn from that.
Thank you.
There's also an idea that we're only supposed to approach God so far. The idea that if you climb too high, we're actually putting too much ego in the game. So a small mountain is just fine, thank you.
Beautiful. Kaya, thank you for that great question. I used my walking stick because the kids and I downstairs, we made walking sticks and we climbed a metaphorical Mount Sinai on our way up.
I thought this was
here.
Moses and the staff or
So
something.
I was making my way up. I was climbing the mountain to the Ten Commandments. And I was asking the kids downstairs, I said, did you notice the Ten Commandments anywhere in the sanctuary upstairs? And someone noticed right away, actually. Aaron noticed on the Aron HaKodesh, you can find the Ten Commandments here in the sanctuary. And now,
I also want to tell you an interesting story. Is Rina Sector Albaz's father, Lloyd, who designed and built this ark for us, also the Torah table here too, which actually represents pieces of the Torah as well, the idea of the two scrolls at the end as well.
beautiful. And that's part of the amazing thing of being a part of a community, you know, how connected we are and how many meaningful moments through generations we share together. So thank you so much to the kids for spending such wonderful time with me downstairs. And now it's my honor to read from this beautiful Torah scroll.
Wow.
It is beautiful.
We are doing a group aliyah?
Absolutely. I'm going to find the first word first because that's how I like to start. Did you find it already, Tali? Boy, Tali is good. There we go. All right, I'm going to do a symbolic kiss for the Torah from us all. And let's join together in a community aliyah. Baruch et Adonai HaMevorach, Baruch Adonai HaMevorach le'olam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher bachar banu mikol hamim, V'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai, Noten HaTorah. Vayered Adonai ahar Sinai al rosh hahar, Vayikra Adonai leMoshe al rosh hahar, Vayal Moshe, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, red ha'ed ba'am, pen yehersu el Adonai l'raot, v'nafal mimenu rav, וגם הכהנים הניגשים אל אדוני יתקדשו ונפרוץ בהם אדוני ויאמר משה אל אדוני לא יוכל עם לעלות ההר סיני כי אתה הודעת בנו לאמור הגבל את ההר וקידשתו ויאמר אליו אדוני לך רד ועלית אתה ואהרון עמך והכהנים והעם אל ירצו לעלות אל אדוני פן יפרוץ בם וירד משה אל העם ויאמר עליהם וידבר אלוהים את כל הדברים האלה לאמור אנוכי אדוני אלוהיך אשר הוצאתיך מארץ מצרים מבית עבדים לא יהיה לך אלוהים אחרים על פניי לא תעשה לך פסל וכל תמונה אשר בשמיים ממעל ואשר בארץ מתחת ואשר במים מתחת לארץ, לא תשתחווה להם, ולא תעבדם, כי אנוכי, אדוני אלוהיך אלקנה, פוקד עוון אבות הבנים, על שלישים ועל רבעים לשונאי, ועושה חסד לאלפים, לא אבי לשומרי מצוותי. לא תישא את שם אדוני אלוהיך לשווא, כי לא ינקה אדוני את אשר יישא את שמו לשווא. זכור את יום השבת לקודשו, 6 ימים תעבוד, ועשית כל מלאכתך, והיום השביעי שבת לאדוני אלוהיך, לא תעשה כל מלאכה, אתה ובנך וביתך, עבדך ואמתך ובהמתך, וגרך אשר בשעריך, כי 6 ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, את הים ואת כל אשר בם, וינח ביום השביעי. על כן ברך אדוני את יום השבת ויקדשהו. כבד את אביך ואת אמך, למען יאריכון ימיך על האדמה אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך. לא תרצח, לא תנאף, לא תגנוב, לא תענה בריחת שקר, לא תחמוד בית רעך, לא תחמוד אשת רעך, ועבדו ואמתו ושורו וחמורו, וכל אשר לרעך. ברוכה תהי. Are you ready for the closing blessing with me? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet, v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
We're not going to do a formal Hagban Glila. We're going to simply wrap the Torah. When that's done, we're going to ask you to stand and we'll do Eitz Chaim He together. Okay, as we return the
Torah to the ark.
Torah to the ark.
This is such a
wait a moment
beautiful
until
Torah.
we just, it is. This is actually the Urim Pen Torah, and we decided today, because of its a joint occasion, as a co-sponsored event, that we'd have a little bit of Shaarey Zedek and a little bit of Temple Shalom. So I'm so delighted that Leslie and Tali were able to approach the Torah. They're the Torah readers at Shaarey Zedek, and how lovely it is that they can come up and read a Torah that was written for our congregation by Urim Pen, Zichronah Livracha.
Thank you. Shalom.
We're really blessed by the incredible diversity of voices we have in this city of ours, especially in the South End as we share these experiences with Shaarey Zedek. We're really right at the end right now, and I know it's all about ice cream and cookies downstairs. I don't want to keep you far away, but we don't have a challah up here, but I just want to, let's do together at least the blessing on the challah as we step into the experience of food afterwards. Together, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. Anybody want to do the Shechianu?
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam
She'echeyanu v'kiyanu v'hiyanu l'hazman hazeh. Before we leave, I really want to thank Marvin Terhawk. I want to thank Miriam. I want to thank Ruth, Judith, Stephen. It took a lot to put this together today because we're combining up different systems, and it required patience that we almost didn't have. But the notion is that this is going to be the first, hopefully, of many things we do together as congregations, and we're working at it. And we want to thank you all for being online and here with us today to be part of this experience. To Rena, to Tali, to Leslie, to Rabah and Email Boss, thank you all so much for your participation in making this all work today. We truly wish you all a Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everyone.
Chag Sameach.